Believe it or not, I've never had much of what geeks and celebrity chefs call a robust palate when it comes to my taste in media. Sure, I've delved into plenty of depths over the years, but I'm no cinephile. A majority of my experiences fell into what I'd call safe picks. Anime, cartoons, platformers, and visual novels, baby. That's what I know, and those are the lanes I mostly stick to. But it's been over a year since I moved in with a guy who has over 2,000 films on Letterboxd and a pokey freak, so whether I wanted to or not, I was about to be subjected to a whole new set of experiences that I had no idea what to do with. From the outset, I was promised madness, and I received it, but I didn't shy away from that. I embraced it and traveled into worlds unknown. I made my own Letterboxd, and partway through the year, I also made a media thread talking about all of the material I buckled down for throughout a tumultuous 2024. This video is a long-form version of that thread I made, a nice year-end capper where I can get slightly more in-depth about my thoughts on everything I tackled without committing to making them larger videos. It's mostly movies and television, but I've sprinkled in a few other big deals I completed along the way, a good few of those being games I streamed right here on the channel. Couple ground rules: I'm only covering stuff I completed from front to back. I'm also not going to get into every stray episode of Seinfeld, every album I listened to, or whatever Sonic essay caught my eye. It's mostly material that's new to me, but I'll count significant revisits if I have something interesting or different to say about it. Also, we're going month to month in chronological order, starting with...
It's January!
I caused the revolution! You betray the law!
So, fun fact, when me and Austin sat down and turned on Netflix to watch this, we got approximately 1 minute in before the power in our entire city went out for 2 hours. I'd like to think that was a force beyond our comprehension trying to help us avoid our fate, but Paul, he had other plans for us. This movie is a late 2000s comedy starring Kevin James. I'd say it has some gigglers, but if I was telling you the truth, those were pity laughs. I'm admittedly kind of obsessed with Pahood, though. I would love an entire spin-off movie explaining what his deal was. Overall, it's not more than what it says it is, and the irony-drenched subculture surrounding it probably outweighs any worth the film itself actually has. But whether you're laughing sincerely or ironically, it's not the worst way to kill time ever conceived by man. But that honor could potentially go to...
You shouldn't even gotten out of bed.
Why did they decide to make a sequel to this movie 6 years later? Why did he immediately get divorced? Well, I've got a bold theory. This movie is nowhere close to good. Though I will say that the villain is so insanely over the top that I might have caught myself laughing specifically at his and Paul's mutual tirades late into the runtime.
You are oblivious to the avalanche of insanity I'm about to unload. You don't know what I will do to you.
You don't know what I'll do to you. I will spin around until I throw up on you and your friends. I simply don't care.
I'll stick your face in maple syrup and make you sing gospel. How does that blow your hair back, Blart?
I will crawl inside you and lay eggs like a baby spider. I welcome it!
Not one of my finest moments, but you cling to what you can in hard times. Unfortunately, this movie has no Pahood, so it is infinitely worse on principle. Never mind the fact that it is objectively just bad. I'm gonna have to write in my diary about this one. Oh, wait a second.
It'll blow you to February 33rd, which does not exist.
Greg Heffley, can you please come to the front of the room and do the problem?
I was a bit of a wimpy kid head back in middle school. I had the do-it-yourself diary, which mainly consisted of me talking about girls I had crushes on. That's in a landfill somewhere. I hope none of those girls are too. The first adaptation is a pretty solid 2-screen put-down of Greg Heffley's eternal struggle to be a normal, if egocentric, non-sadistic human being. I'm not sure he achieves it, especially since he eventually went on to be in Genshin Impact, but it's an enjoyable family flick nevertheless. The original elements are weak. I have no idea why Chloe Grace Moretz even shows up, but it's got the spirit of its source, so it does fine enough. How about that older brother?
Do you have anything you want to say to women for having owned this offensive magazine?
I'm sorry, women.
I wouldn't give Roderick Rules a much higher score than its predecessor, but I'd argue it is still marginally better. Greg has an overall more solid character arc in this, and Roderick's portrayal has always been the most entertaining element of these films. Since I've seen it, I just can't ever stop thinking about the scene where he exclaims, "That's not me," once Dad Heffley discovers his party photos. Mainly because Devin Bostick sells the line so hilariously that it sounds less like he's bullshitting, and more like he's genuinely terrified there may be a clone of him out there somewhere. Solid.
Loaded diaper activate.
right.
Letterboxd tells me I had literally nothing to say about this one, which seems appropriate. It's not a bad movie or anything, it's just kind of more of the same. Your average kid learns to appreciate a stuck-up old dad-type flick that helps teens and parents understand each other better. And that's fine, but Dog Days doesn't do anything groundbreaking with it. Greg is far and away the most insufferable in this film when compared to the others, though. This movie puts the third and fourth books together, and it's about the point at which I dropped off the series as a kid. So for all I know, Greg has gotten up to even more interminable evil since then. I stopped watching the movies here too, less because I have standards, and more because I at least like consistency in my evil.
What, we some kind of Suicide Squad?
This movie is really stupid, but it's stupid in such a compellingly heartfelt way that I appreciate it more than anything in this age of cape shit overload. There's a lot of really fun and inventive visuals and cinematography in this, as well as some moments that genuinely made me giggle with joyous whimsy. The finale is exactly the kind of nonsense I wish more comic book movies had the nuts to do, instead of brooding over its own seriousness for half the runtime. It's not high art, but it doesn't really have to be in order for me to have a really good time. Make sure you check on the rats in your walls tonight, they're probably lonely.
What smells like blue?
I watched this without realizing it was based on a manga. Good thing, because I read it afterward and didn't enjoy it nearly as much. This is one of those artsy, slow films about being a gay teenager and how hard that is, so if you're terminally unable to connect with experiences unlike your own, you may want to pass on this one. For my money, I found it really beautiful. It's extremely down-to-earth with such painful pathos. There are many parts of this film that literally made me feel like I was having my stomach twisted into knots. It knows exactly when to be contemplative and quiet, which lends it this consistent air of restraint and longing, which colors so many feelings of queerness which are especially potent in our youth. Watching this left me feeling mournful, but it also reminded me how important it is to live genuinely and to love genuinely. You only get one chance to live on this earth, so don't make yourself invisible for it.
What am I supposed to do? You're dying.
This movie is every bit the visual marvel people say it is, and it's a triumph narratively, too. Who would have guessed that animated IP films can actually reach the heights of their predecessors if they have something to say? This is ostensibly a children's movie about how we compartmentalize and deal with death in our lives, and if that sounds like a heavy subject, it is, but The Last Wish handles it in such a fun and sincere way that I struggle to think of any major issues it has. Call me a furry if you want, but this is almost certainly the best rendition of death seen on the big screen in God knows how long. Also, John Mulaney was probably blasted beyond belief while recording for this, and that definitely makes his performance as Big Jack Horner even wilder. If you missed out on this, you're missing out on probably one of hands down the best Shrek films since Shrek 2. One of, if not the best DreamWorks films, and one of the best children's films in the past 2 decades.
Lousy smarch weather.
Will it be caustic caramel cream, horrific hazelnut, mutating marshmallow, or antidote?
This movie had way more fun choreography and music than it actually had any right to. It's definitely dead IP slop to keep the copyright chugging, but I would charitably say that it's more to do with its commission than the way the product itself turned out. The movie in a vacuum does actually have a lot of fun ideas, and definitely seems like the people working on it cared about making something good. So I'd call it genuinely enjoyable if you put it on in the background one afternoon. They're never making a great glass elevator movie, so I guess I can compromise by watching comically evil rich guys trying to drown Timothy Chalamet in chocolate. Yes, that is a real thing that happens in this movie.
April Fools. Jerk.
The flames of disaster!
Dude, I love Wade Whipple. Oh man, Wade Whipple is my favorite character. Can't get whipped with the Whipple. If you or a loved one has ever said this to yourself while watching the first 2 Sonic movies, this is a show that was made for you. You are not entitled to financial compensation, but the electric chair is down the hall to the left. Aside from some halfway decent visuals and a fun needle drop or 2 here and there, this is largely forgettable at best and actively painful to watch the entire rest of the runtime. The middle of the show is such a slog to get through, and even a fun musical episode can't save it. Even though that was definitely the best episode. The plot is also just painfully mediocre. There were so many opportunities to take some inspiration from the source and turn it into something greater, but instead it settles for being the first Sonic movie, but infinitely worse. It just doesn't know when to shut up. I swear a solid 60% of this thing's runtime could have been cut, and it would have been better off. It is a literal crime to cast an actor as talented as Christopher Lloyd for a character like Pachacamac and then do nothing with him. Like, I know the Sonic movie universe is its own thing with its own rules and ways of characterizing its cast, but am I the only one who thinks it's a bit weird to take a guy whose sole function is to be a cautionary tale, a power-hungry warmonger who gets nearly all of his people killed, and to uncritically turn him into a great hero whose accomplishments go completely unquestioned throughout the entire narrative, and then have him run a mystic bowling alley. There's such a great conceptual through line with Wade's dad turning out to be an asshole, setting up a natural parallel between Wade and Knuckles, having Knuckles realize his hero was also a monster. But no, that could have been cool. Instead, we have the titular character literally sitting around in a hotel room, doing nothing for a majority of one of the final episodes. One of basically 3 episodes where he does next to nothing, by the way. While Adam Pally tries to win at bowling. Awesome. Also, they sincerely tried to reference the Holocaust. What is with weird Knuckles the Echidna media and doing that? I mean, I know it's only happened twice, but this is way more than you would hope. Between lackluster writing, a severe lack of focus, painful missed opportunities, and one of the most grating additions to the human cast this film franchise has ever seen, I did not care much for Knuckles. Ellie Taylor is fun though. I like evil women. What can I say but Wade Whiffled?
You gonna impale me on that pompadour?
Bitch, no!
Oh, she's just like me for real. Saying this in any way about the protagonist of Psychopomp is a sign that you should talk to a counselor. This is a 3D horror dungeon crawler, which reminds me of what it was like to have unfiltered internet access in the 2000s, and innumerable undisclosed mental illnesses. It's a somewhat rudimentary feeling game, with a rigidness that juxtaposes well against its very harsh, eclectic visuals and overall presentation. Everything in this is very ethereal and abrasive, but it's never boring. It reminds me a lot of things from this time period, Lane, LSD Dream Emulator, and many a creepypasta, but it's more than just the sum of its parts. Also, this first version of the game is totally free, so you kinda have no excuse not to try it out. 10 out of 10 would use a hammer to turn weird skin creatures with anime faces into giblets again.
May.
I'm not the ass man. I think there's been a mistake.
Apparently, this was a dream project of Jerry Seinfeld's for a while, one of the rare exploits which has brought his interest back to the screen, which you wouldn't know based on how bizarrely aimless and perplexingly dry Unfrosted is. It's dry, like its namesake. Dry like a low-fat toaster pastry without any frosting. This is ostensibly a space race narrative, filtered through the lens of cereal companies, which honestly sounds pretty ripe for comedic exploration, but unfortunately this was done by Jerry Seinfeld. What you get instead is a bunch of lame wordplay from the mouth of every heavy hitter in the C-tier comedy pantheon. These are jokes you could find in the back of a $5 Scholastic breakfast puns pamphlet you buy at your elementary school book fair. Jerry insists you couldn't do Seinfeld anymore these days, because of woke, but I'd argue he should focus on making something funny on his own before evaluating the political climate. Also, Larry David would probably have some words for you about that one Pop-Tart boy. You know, right after he's done strangling Elmo, I guess. Uniquely terrible, don't waste your time.
Shorty chose to be with a demon, sounds like her problem to me.
It may be a little strange to call a horror game cozy, but that's what Crow Country is to me. This game is very much a return to form for people who enjoy weird little horror games on PS1, complete with settings that harken back to those old pre-rendered diorama-esque backgrounds seen in games like Final Fantasy VII. There's a lot to love here, both from a gameplay and design perspective. It occupies a similar vibe in my mind to something like the original Resident Evil games. Sure, it has its terrifying moments and overall dreadful tone, but it also has an energy to it that allows it to feel somewhat over the top in an entertainingly B-movie-esque manner. Also, speaking as someone who grew up near Atlanta throughout a majority of my life, the fact that this game is set in it made playing through it way funnier than it had any right to be. Like, yeah, you know, I'd be willing to believe a place like this exists in Georgia.
I'm on that shit that made Michael Vick stupid.
Really digestible, mechanically solid, it does struggle with some annoying combat and backtracking here and there, but for the most part, it is an incredible distilled love letter to the type of game it's harkening back to. A modern must-play for survival horror nuts.
You know who else is the honored one?
Are you mid because you're Jujutsu Kaisen? Or are you Jujutsu Kaisen because you're mid? I joke, we aren't quite there yet. Jujutsu Kaisen is a series that's been doing pretty well over the past few years, and up to this point of the narrative, it's easy to see why it was Shonen Jump's third newest golden child for a long while. Hidden Inventory is one of the best portions of the series, expertly weaving its themes into a well-earned, if kinda sudden, flashback that casts the entire rest of the story that follows in an immensely tragic light. I disagree with the practices of MAPPA that got this anime into the state that it is in, but in a vacuum, all the resulting production is jaw-dropping. I already really liked this arc in the manga, and its animated counterpart was well worth watching. As well as...
This is giving me major Persona vibes.
You've reached your peak, kid. This is the point where people think Jujutsu Kaisen starts to get real, which is awesome, because it's also the point where everything afterward drops off massively. The anime adaptation understands the bombast and weight that made this arc so fun to follow in the manga, and its animation is, to put in a word, horrifying. I mean this in a good way, like, damn, it's scary good, but also in the sense that I can hear the animator's bones crunching to dust with every kinetic masterstroke this season put in front of my eyes. Might as well go out with a bang, right? In retrospect, though, I don't feel that Shibuya Incident was the greatest battle shonen gut punch put to page in the last few decades like so many others did. It's awkward in a good chunk of its pacing, and some of its heaviest beats really underserve the characters they revolve around. Nobara, I am so sorry, my goat, they wasted you. Regardless, this is still a great watch. I hope the anime adds something to make me like the next few arcs more than I did in the source material, because who, brother?
It's too high! Dude, I got an arm!
The Big Catch is a funny little furry platformer with charming polygonal graphics, something I've been known to obsess over, so choosing to back it on Kickstarter was a really easy sell. What resulted is a demo that has a lot of promise and potential depth, but needs some definite tweaking to get to that sweet spot that it's aiming for. Putting aside its excellent music and interesting mechanics, what you get feels mostly like a game brimming with ideas made by people who needed to give those ideas more time in the oven. The conveyance is not great, the controls are stiffer on all ends than they need to be, and the challenge level is unforgiving, to put it bluntly. It feels like everything in the game is just a few degrees to the left from perfection, and while that doesn't sound like much, it winds up being a death by 1,000 fishing hooks situation. I'm excited to see what the final product will look like with a hefty round of feedback under the devs' belts, but for right now, toss the line back out, all we're pulling is bait.
What are your plans for cleaning up our environment?
9/11.
You ever just laugh? Madam Web is a film. That's about all I can say about it with certainty. Instead of trying to tell you whether or not the plot was well written, or if the visuals were good, or anything like that, I can describe my experience with this movie succinctly by telling you that the logistics of a taxi made me laugh so hard I nearly cried. This movie is the cinematic equivalent of staying up until 5 a.m. in a Discord call and having everyone slowly lose coherence via sleep deprivation until everything is funny. It is hardly appealing, but it is entertaining, and sometimes that's enough to recommend something. Later in the year, I went to see an AJJ concert, and the bar hosting them had this playing on the TVs in the background. This was so distracting that I had to tear my eyes away from it at any time it entered my peripheral vision. Spiders out of 10.
Baby, Bluey, Ohio.
It's a digital circus out there, Pibby. You'd have to be a hell of a boss to get through these back rooms. Luckily, you have a couple of Smiling Friends to Smiling Friends is a show that, despite some personal issues I hold with it, has been a lot of fun up until this point because of its particular hodgepodge of ultra-specific humor and animation. It has such memorable zingers that have entered my daily vocal stim rotation through the banter of its likable cast of characters. Watching through season 1 was a blast, and it often left me surprised as to how much I enjoyed myself episode to episode. The second season has a lot of second verse same as the first material, which I would say sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. And while overall it is more or less on par with its predecessor, this batch still felt weaker than the initial one. It was just a smidge disappointing after waiting so long for it. It feels weird saying it about the most eccentric show on television right now, but I think they really need to either experiment further or stick to the job-to-job episode model, because right now, its loose structure is making it feel a little aimless to me. Really liked that Alan episode, though.
Are you kidding? This is how our show ends?
Dude, I think her body just did that. This is a spin-off manga for the Higurashi franchise, and if you know anything about me, it's that I'll never shut up about the series, not ever, don't even ask. This story is something of a shakeup, taking place primarily in a setting that isn't focused on too terribly much in the original VN, starring its own original character, and pairing her with one of the fan favorites, Shion Zonozaki, for a cool murder mystery. The plot is honestly pretty interesting, and the small insights it offers into Shion are well worth giving it a look if you, like me, appreciate peak characters. Unfortunately though, for reasons unknown, this manga was cancelled after only 3 chapters, leaving the roadmap it was to chart looking pretty blank by its untimely end. Still a fun novelty for what it is, though.
Knife! Huh?
Speaking of murder mysteries, there are very few that come close to being as tightly put together as this. Knives Out is a movie so ubiquitous to this genre that to get into why it's great would probably just be like putting on a broken record, so I'll save my breath and say that if you've already seen this, you know why it's a masterpiece, and if you haven't, you should leave now, fix that, and then come back to thank me later. Now I've just gotta get around to watching Glass Onion already.
What kind of heat y'all got? Heat, bruh, it's fucking hot.
Woo, I'm about to make a name for myself here.
You know, you can even have nostalgia for bad things. This movie is far from perfect, and it is a little too willing to stroke itself off, but it is somewhat earned. I'm not a big Marvel head, even on the worst of days, and this iteration of the Merc is far more mouthy than he should be, and in films that involve Ryan Reynolds, that is almost always a death sentence. Still, Deadpool and Wolverine has enough heart to push it over the finish line. It's a sweet send-off to the early aughts Fox era of comic book movies, and has some nice, if boilerplate, things to say about franchise stagnation, and the worth of imperfect products to the audiences who are hardcore fans of them, even if most critics call it bad. It's a decently worthwhile conversation to have, and I'm kinda shocked Disney let half of this out the door. Also, that Madonna needle drop kinda went hard as hell.
You're the sad figment of my twisted psyche's tragic dividend.
I have a video coming about this one, so I'm not gonna say too much about it, but watching this made me want to throw up. It's awesome. Please watch it.
Die a violent death.
When T-posing models and absolutely dogshit launch performance fail you, it is time for your television PR facelift. Because of that, Cyberpunk Edgerunners was able to give the game it was advertising, Cyberpunk 2077, a new lease on life when it came out back in 2022. It's slick, it's stylish, it has killer pacing, really solid thematic work, and extremely likable characters. It has cool as hell designs, an OST which absolutely dominated my Spotify history for months, and oh yeah, it was also animated by Trigger. Go figure. Really the only complaint I have about Edgerunners is that its pacing gets a bit too quick toward the back half, but this goes for just about every show Trigger has ever made, so at least it's not a bucked trend. If you haven't seen this show, especially because the property it's tied to has rightfully turned you off, I'd strongly encourage biting the fancy futuristic bullet and giving it a watch anyway. I'm going to be stewing on this one for years, and I wouldn't recommend robbing yourself of that chance.
And then I'll put that flea in a box, and then I'll put that box inside of another box, and then I'll mail that box to myself. And when it arrives, I'll smash it with a hammer!
Imagine this premise with me, if you will. A university professor visits an isolated island with a secure prison housing one of the world's most intelligent and fascinating serial killers, a woman he finds upsettingly similar to himself. Upon arriving at the building she's been kept in for over a decade, the power goes out, the door to her room she's never left lifts, and out wheels what appears to be a mannequin, but soon proves to be the woman's corpse in a wedding dress. If this seems like an insane premise, I'm sorry to tell you that this is about the time where The Perfect Insider began to lose me. I really wanted to like this show. Between a few decently interesting characters, a stellar pairing of OP and ED, and some fun visuals here and there, this was all shaping up to be something that on any other day I would think was my exact type of shit. Unfortunately, it soon becomes a bit of a slogfest, with a backstory I found dreadfully frustrating, and a convoluted murder plan with none of the heart necessary to back it up. This is among the worst of the genre to treat a mystery as a puzzle box first and a story second, and while I hope the novel it's based on is better, watching this made it difficult for me to want to give it a try. Oh well.
9/11 was bad.
I too once had a DeviantArt account. Turning Red is, for my money, the best of Pixar's output in the past decade. There are plenty of coming-of-age stories out there, but I think this one feels uniquely geared toward my generation, even if I didn't live in Toronto or run the risk of turning into a giant red panda when I lost control of my hormones. Very rarely does it feel like family films have the guts to interrogate these sorts of subjects without implicitly assuming it is inappropriate for the target audience. And this movie is such a breath of fresh air in the sense that it knows that stuff we all deal with at that age. Sure, it's filtered through a sort of fantastical plot device, but it gestures towards something real, and I think that's something Pixar at its best has always been very good at. This was a great return to form for the studio in many ways, but also inventive and different in the ways that count, with an extremely fun art style and animation that carries its simple but effective story well past the finish line.
I can feel the fungi munching on my brain.
What do you mean you lost the baby? Go find it.
Edgar Wright banger, let's go! This movie is non-stop fun. So solidly stitched together, the sound design and choreography both in the action and in the music is top-notch. There aren't many films that utilize their soundtracks as effectively as Baby Driver does, and I just have to give it such immense props. The only real stain on this movie is that Kevin Spacey plays a major role in it, but his character is a shitbag who dies anyway, so I can satisfy myself with that. Anyway, he would have robbed those banks like 90% more effectively if he'd been listening to Umineko music.
Bananas.
Kids, you need to go into your room right now. Michael Keaton is outside. This movie is absolute camp. I can see why it's endured for so long despite its less savory Burtonisms. The practical effects in particular are a lot of fun, and while I was surprised to see Beetlejuice himself has relatively little screen time, every minute he's around he is constantly chewing the scenery and making it shine. What a perfectly entertaining sleaze bag. Winona Ryder is of course excellent here too. Oh, she's just like me for real. While by the end I wish it had a little more variety, I understand the hype. Would buy a Beetlejuice shot glass at Hot Topic.
Lance, you're not falling for that old joke, are you?
This decades too late sequel is weird. It feels like 3 interesting ideas for a Beetlejuice follow-up squeezed together into one movie, and the result isn't bad, but it does feel disjointed. The pacing isn't the best in the world, there's too many characters, and some of the jokes genuinely made me roll my eyes. But solid performances from both the legacy cast and new faces, plus a commitment to the fun visual effects the first film was known for, are solid enough points in my book to make this one worth watching. Best sequel ever? Nah. A fun night at the theater though? Definitely. Go, Jenna Ortega. Now you can be the relatable goth girl.
You calling me a liar?
I ain't calling you a truther.
This movie is actually kind of a riot. I was having a great time with this. The early aughts humor can be dated at times, but it is solid throughout. The casting is great, Paul Giamatti absolutely kills it as this petty smurf. Everything was going good. Hey, even Jaleel White is here, and he's great! And then the credits hit and I saw that it was a Dan Schneider joint. I have literally never been so jump scared by a screenplay credit in my life. I had to sit there for a while and stare into the frigid moon. I had to take a walk. I'm not even joking, I literally took a walk. Had I just fallen victim to the enemy's tricks? No, this can't be. In all seriousness, good movie, but I hate that guy. You're blue now, that's my attack.
Do you want to drink?
Speaking of staring into the frigid moon and taking a walk, this is a video game about talking to yourself while you're going to buy milk and having an existential crisis while doing so. Pretty relatable. Milk inside a bag of milk is a really short experience, and yet it is damn impactful in that extremely slim window of time. Its visuals are rudimentary, but know exactly when and how to make their point. The structure of the game doesn't pull its punches on how massive and overwhelming seemingly simple tasks can be when you literally have no room to process what's going on around you. It's a fantastic, if simple game, made even better by
Josh! Pour me a glass of milk!
Yeah, guess what? It has a sequel, and it's even better. Milk Outside a Bag of Milk has absolutely gorgeous pixel art and a perfectly moody soundtrack now stacked on top of the writing chops of its predecessor. It's also longer and more involved, picking up right from the end of its prior entry and exploring the psyche of its main character during the process of picking up her room. Internet relationships, behavioral issues, school, cyclical abuse, and plenty of other interesting topics rear their head from the minds of this surprisingly self-contained experience. I can't recommend its dosage of heaviness very casually, but I can say that if you're down to engage with something sympathetic to the ways in which we grieve and isolate ourselves, you'd do well to steel yourself and take a dive in. Take an ending guide with you. You really don't want to miss any of the places this game goes. Great duology. Wait, I don't even drink milk.
Are you being intentionally dense?
Calling this bad in a good way would be a backhanded compliment, especially because I think in all the ways that count, House is not bad by any means. It has what many would consider to be an insane plot and corny, amateurish visuals, but it is the shining heart underneath that proves to me that beyond technical detail, passion is the most important aspect of creative endeavors. This also isn't even accounting for the fact that the film's visuals are intentionally juvenile, to mirror the often fantastically ethereal fears of actual children, who conceive of much more bizarre terrors than the mundane ones we as adults often stay awake over. This is a movie with a lot of interesting things to say, particularly with its sprinklings of historical commentary, and I think those aspects are worth paying attention to, even if your attention will often be forcibly torn away by the Super Mario 64 piano or that one girl doing fighting game poses every few minutes. House is a movie, but not derisively. It's a movie in all the weird, wackiest, and most lovable ways possible. Saying it's good or bad is mere foreplay to the experience you could have if you simply watched it yourself, which you should.
Hey, you know what this place looks like? Looks like Pumpkin Hill!
Oh, it's finally finished! A memoir of my life written in red ink!
Evangelizing this series is not something I need to do for the millionth time. I name drop it in my videos often enough, and I use its music on a regular basis. I even have an entire video dedicated to giving the elevator pitch for it if you need any further insight into whether it's for you. I've read Umineko about 4 to 5 times from front to back in my life, which should tell you a lot because it takes over 150 hours to read. Understandably, many are intimidated by its length, but if I'm willing to do that with my very likely ADHD-addled brain, that should do more than enough to illustrate my point. For about 10 months straight in 2024, I streamed this funny meta murder mystery Greek tragedy anime energy sword visual novel tour de force weekly in an effort to share my love of it with others, who maybe found the task of diving in daunting, and I couldn't be happier with the results. They say the best way to experience Umineko is to share it with others, and I have to agree. Between the copious amounts of amazing fan art, hours upon hours of theory discussion from the newbies, and me pouring my blood, sweat, and tears into not only narrating every line, but voice acting every single character, this stream series was something extremely special to me. By some miraculous force of nature, I was able to end this series off on October 4th, the most significant date in Umineko's narrative, and I never felt so happy to be streaming for an audience in my life, the tears rolling down my face all over again as they did for many others in the room. One of my close friends watched that final stream from inside the mansion used as a model for Umineko's primary setting, and within minutes of starting that night, the chat had funded an incentive for me to get an Umineko tattoo, a design for which was selected in a poll entirely by said viewers. My father's death happened in the summer of this year, and I've made no secret that was incredibly tough on me. Seeing as Umineko is so brilliant at touching on the complexity of familial relationships and grief, it didn't escape me how special it was to share this experience with others during one of the most otherwise difficult times in my life. Nor how, when I finally got that tattoo I mentioned, my appointment happened to land on what would have been his birthday. A tattoo which reiterates one of this novel's most simple and yet most important messages. One that I've held in my heart since first reading it all those years ago, and will always remember even now. Without love, it cannot be seen. Please read Umineko if you haven't already. If you need it, all of my streams are archived in a playlist on my channel. Could be a good way for you to start.
I love anime!
And manga!
Yuri's grown in stranger places. I already made a video back in the day about the one-shot this is based on, so I'll keep my thoughts on this brief. I love Look Back, so when I heard it was getting adapted into film form, I was cautiously optimistic, but also a little worried. It's a pretty short story for one thing, so I wondered if it would get needlessly expanded, and if the adaptation would really do anything special worth watching over its source material. What I found when I sat down to watch this in a theater is that not only does it do its source material every bit of justice it deserves, but it does successfully put its own loving touch on said material without needlessly expanding it. This is a pitch-perfect adaptation. The innumerable little touches in the animation are breathtakingly charming, the voice performances are wonderfully naturalistic, and the score, oh man, the score. I wish I could shake Haruka Nakamura's hand, because the perfect symmetry between swelling and silence here is something to behold, and well worth having heard on theater sound equipment. If you've never read Look Back, you probably should before watching this, not because you won't understand it, but just because it's really good. And as far as adaptations go, especially when it comes to a story all about the collaborative process of art and how we communicate with each other through it, you can't get much better than this. 10 out of 10, how dare they make me cry over something I already knew was going to happen.
Well, I'm the Joker, baby!
This movie is extremely cute. It has a really charming narrative and characters, very fun animation, and a surprisingly adept score. Definitely some top-tier DreamWorks fare that squeezed a few tears out of me by the end of its runtime. Also, I do love robot moms. Not for any particular reason, I assure you. I don't have a ton to say about this one aside from that, but the circumstances under which I went to go see it were very funny. You see, Austin barged into my room one night and told me every day for a week straight that he was going to force me to go see Joker 2 with him. I dreaded it the entire time. Up until the very last second, he was even enlisting the help of a friend to catch me up on what happened in the first Joker, since I'd never seen it. Our AMC is an old rave theater that became a Carmike before getting refurbished, and because of that, we don't have the names of the movies playing above each individual theater. So imagine my shock when at the end of the surprisingly family-friendly previews that played before Joker 2, I see the DreamWorks logo and realize that this definitely isn't Joker 2. In retrospect, I had a lot better of a time watching this than I would have had watching that, so it worked out.
That actually is pretty funny.
Dude,
Let's kill the horse.
I've heard about worse bronies before, if you can believe it. Mouthwashing is one of those indie darlings that if you have a functioning set of eyes and some degree of love for video games, you've probably seen it discussed to death online in the last several months, and streamed even more so, including by myself. So I'll save you the spiel by opting not to pretend you don't already know what it is. That being said, perhaps not uniquely, it is f***ing brilliant. The atmosphere is oppressively choking. It is so haunting to walk around in the POV of a complete monster and see what makes him tick. And the developers did a fantastic job of imparting everything they wanted to with this cast of characters. Some of its puzzles and interactive elements can leave a bit to be desired, but this is less a game that you play for the thrilling gameplay than it is a game that you play to get hurt by something. That said, mouthwashing isn't a game that hurts you for hurting's sake, as much as I'd say it hurts you in a constructive way. It holds up a mirror, and it tells you exactly what it thinks of the world it was made in, and then it asks you how you're going to participate in it. Through the vector of a deeply neurotic crew of space Amazon employees who have a few more problems than the mouthwash they're forced to have for dinner. This is a tough game to power through, but if you have the strength, I'd absolutely suggest doing so.
You've got the shinin.
You mean shining.
Shh! You wanna get sued?
Average novelist husband experience. This movie has been examined in every single direction possible for many, many years, and I am not the one who's going to crack the code on my gay little YouTube channel 45 down the line. But I will say that, yeah, it's pretty good. I can understand why King himself is pretty meh on this, because when I read about how it stacks up to the novel, it's clear that Kubrick had his own vision of said material that reigned above necessarily embodying it. I'd also be remiss not to mention that despite the outstanding performances on display from Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall, rest her soul, the conditions on set that made these performances possible were not really worth it. Iconography is only worth so much when the cost is actual human suffering, instead of just the simulation thereof. I almost feel bad giving this film as heavy of a recommendation as I am, because I do think it rightfully deserves its place in film history. Its cinematography is some of the best in the business. Its scoring is discordantly horrific. This movie really synergizes all of its elements to make you feel the same emotions as someone trapped in this situation. And the way it all crawls up on you is as respectable as it is dreadful. I just wish that it had been made under slightly more humane circumstances. Anyway, good job, team. Can't wait for The Shining 2.
So you shut those sleepy eyes and hop aboard the Dreamland Express. Hop aboard the Dreamland Express!
Okay, well shit, I wasn't being serious. This film is really interesting in that it's definitely under the shadow of Kubrick's Shining adaptation leaning over it, but instead of feeling indebted to treat it reverently, or tear it down in favor of King's vision, it does make a strong balancing act between the two, and in doing so, strengthens its own themes about respecting your past while working to overcome it. Of course, this is still a Stephen King story, so getting a bit lost in its own sauce is sort of the name of the game. There's a lot more emphasis on the supernatural elements here, and some of said supernatural stuff can feel like word salad if you're coming right off the previous film, which heavily de-emphasized some of those elements, and you're not super familiar with the way King does these things. It was written on coke for a reason. It pulls it together quite admirably despite that. All of the nods to the original film are done in creative ways that feel like they serve an actual function beyond just soy-jacking at the reference, and Ewan McGregor's performance is an especially fantastic one. The scene he shares in the film's third act with not Jack Torrance is something that unexpectedly put actual human tears in my eyes, and I wasn't really prepared for it. Speaking of that third act, it's one of the most insane I've seen in a movie in a good long while. It handles its enormous shift as well as it possibly can. It does feel a bit like two films stitched together in that way, but it's the best possible way, bridging the gap between the sensibilities of two clashing creatives and making something both cohesive and satisfying in the process. I don't think that this will be for all Shiners, but if you haven't seen it yet, you owe it to yourself to give it a shot.
Shadow!
I made a video about this already, please watch it. It didn't do super well. The TLDR is that gameplay-wise, it's some of the best Sonic content we've gotten in years, and story-wise, it was especially cathartic for me, someone grappling with grief during its release and beyond. Truly, that little hedgehog gets me. This isn't all Shadow had on his plate this year, of course, but wait a while down the list for me to get to that. Also, play Shadow Generations, you goof.
You know, but mostly fighting. It's a mental game. Really?
Yo, new Edgar Wright! Wait, no? Oh. Well, it kind of feels like it wants to be. I saw the trailer for this one and was hoping it would be really good, and what I got was something decent that was mostly elevated by its spectacular action scenes and H. John Benjamin being H. John Benjamin. The plot is fairly interesting, but it has one of those endgame twists where the entire thing just becomes instantly deflated and a lot less interesting when it hits. Ultimately, by that time, the movie more or less coalesces into a sum of pretty cool set pieces strung together by a way less memorable story. It had some fun comedic beats though, I'll give it that. A decent action flick, but not really one I'm going to be thinking much about beyond some of its more inventive visuals, for the most part. Boy Kills World, more like me sleep in my bed because I'm tired, okay. Alright, the next stretch is going to be a big pile of horror movies, good and bad, that Austin and I decided to plow through over the course of a few days because we have the worst sleep schedules imaginable. Spirit of Halloween and all that jazz. And of course, we have to start the season off with something really special. Something like, oh, I don't know.
What's that? Hair? Hair? Oh, bear!
The public domain is such a beautiful thing, isn't it? The second something enters it, we get stupid shit like this. Unfortunately, beyond the inherent hilarity of its premise, Winnie the Pooh and friends becoming weird stone-silent serial killers because Christopher Robin decided to get his GED, there is almost nothing else to grasp onto. A stupidly silly setup does not a good movie make, and I think this film is way too focused on that beyond actually making something worth watching. What it ends up feeling like is like a cutscene movie of a 2012 Unity horror game that you would have seen Markiplier play while dryly laughing at. Actually, scratch that. This would have been on Gaming Garbage and Lotax would have played it while, I don't know, being a bad father. It's clearly just a bunch of loose ideas for scares and kills stitched together into the most bare-bones plot possible, whose subplots barely matter because everyone relevant to them just dies at the end anyway. I will say Pooh's one spoken line of dialogue did make me laugh really hard though, so there's that. Offensively boring waste of time. Send it down the slop pipe.
It's true, Rabbit. It lags a bit in the middle.
Oh good. Just when the Benadryl nap was getting too exciting. This movie is actually not as bad as the first one, I will say. It moved up a whole 1.5 stars from my previous ranking, in fact. I mean, that movie only got 0.5 star from me, but still. Blood and Honey 2 is a movie that is not only dedicated to sort of taking the piss out of the first one, but to immediately become much more schlocky and fun in the process. And I can appreciate that pivot. It does not take itself seriously at all, but rather than expecting the audience to fill in the blanks and be entertained by the mere idea of a Winnie the Pooh horror movie, it actually makes one, complete with much better production value, kills, and even a convoluted tragic backstory where they have, I don't know, like Bendy and the Ink Machine or something. This movie is stupid as hell, but thankfully it knows that, and as a result, it's way more fun than it is boring. This is the kind of bad I can vibe with. It's Poohin' time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you get addicted to crack? Did somebody get addicted to crack?
This is the kind of bad I cannot vibe with. This movie is just dreadful. It doesn't even really have a premise beyond what if you were at Dave & Buster's and your boss got possessed by evil Mickey Mouse. If it sounds really stupid, trust me, it's even stupider than the stupid you think it is. For being an R-rated film too, it really doesn't have much in the way of kills outside of the ending, and what it does have is surprisingly tame for much of the run. I wondered at first if it was PG-13, but it's provably not because of some other stuff in it, so this really does just come off as laziness or lack of budget, both of which I would not be surprised to hear were the culprits. The only real compliment I can give this one is that the cast occasionally has some decent chemistry between their extremely stilted dialogue exchanges. And a special note should go out to Mackenzie Mills, who perfectly sells the absurdity of what she's given with an amount of seriousness that, while not deserved by this film, certainly couldn't hurt it any more than literally everything else about it. I wouldn't even watch this one again for the novelty. I hope the actors get better work in the future and had fun making this, because it was miserable to watch.
I'm happy, 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 not mad, mad, mad.
Dude, just look away. This one caused a stir when it came out, and you can see why by the end of its first 10 minutes. Yeah, it's a jump scare fest, but some of those jump scares are actually very well executed. The premise is really eerie in a very fun way, and some shots are absolutely to die for. No pun intended. It's a film that's just constant manic tension. Where I think it ultimately failed for me, though, was how it tried to stick the landing. I saw what the movie was going for, but ultimately it put its well-intentioned foot a bit too far in its mouth and suffers as a result. This left me feeling a bit hollowed by the ending, which I also think was serviceable, but that's about the only word I can muster to describe it. Overall, it has a solid middle, bookended by a fantastic intro and an underwhelming finale. It's good, but it's not great. This movie happens on Discord like all the time. Saying this is a bizarre movie isn't really enough, to be honest. It has some decent character work, especially with the mom and what she's going through, but for your average strangely evil child plotline, Orphan is hurt by a number of issues, including both its wildly messy tone and exceedingly slow second act. Also, the twist is interesting, to say the least. I think most people already know it through osmosis, but I'll still keep it vague here in case people want to seek it out for themselves. For what it's worth, it's a somewhat clever way to subvert the ontologically evil child trope that I tend to hate, but it also plays into other aspects of the movie's plot that I find distasteful at best. At least in how they're presented. They sure did make some decisions with this young actress that I can't say that I'm super cool with, is all I'll say. Speaking of her though, Isabelle Fuhrman is one of the few things about this movie I can unambiguously compliment. She's very talented, and I think walks the line well between sinister and genuinely childlike, in a way I think a lot of child actors with similar roles really struggle with. This is not a movie that suffers from its acting, just its execution. I'd be interested to see how she does in this movie's semi-recent prequel, where she maintains the same role despite being far older now. Maybe next Halloween. Not a movie I would call especially good, but it has some decent aspects, I guess. Not in a rush to watch it again, though.
Following you.
Okay. But what if you got it on an omnidirectional treadmill? I'm really glad I finally got around to this one, even if I think the premise is kinda odd. It's thematically cogent and what it's going for is cool and creative, but I'd say its best aspect is easily its cinematography and its direction. This is just a fantastic movie to look at, not only because of its incredibly detailed set design, but because it's perfectly mastered the visual language of cinema to make things as oppressive as humanly possible. You wouldn't think the simple idea of a weird shape-shifting creature just walking toward you constantly could be made especially scary more than a couple of times, but they make it work exceedingly well. I'm floored by how flawlessly they were able to crank up the fear with this, to the point where every time you see someone innocently pacing down the street in this movie, it becomes a life-threatening situation, turning even the most casual of vignettes into what feels like an unending, active threat. Just a masterclass in visual tension, truly. If you're a big fan of atmosphere, give this one a watch. Also, remember that sex makes you blind and go to hell before you die.
I don't want to hear anything about, I don't believe in vampires. Because I don't fucking believe in vampires. What I believe in my own two eyes, and what I saw is fucking vampires.
The kids are going back to ballet. That's how dire it is in the Fortnite community right now. This movie is the perfect embodiment of campy horror to me. Radio Silence is one of my favorite groups making horror movies in the genre right now, and their newest original goes to show why I think it's a shame that they're not going to keep carrying the Scream franchise. The performances are excellent from everyone involved, the movie has a decent thematic through line, and oh my god, the final act of this movie. If you've ever wanted a good Resident Evil adaptation, I'd honestly just recommend watching this and pretending it's like a spin-off or something. Maybe it's because this one cop guy just kind of looks like a relative of Wesker. This is not the type of horror movie that you should watch if you're expecting something especially grounded or super dramatic. But if you love a bloody good time with some unexpected sprinklings of heart, I don't think you can go wrong here. Easily one of my favorite horror movies of the year, and perfectly suited to a group watch with a few drinks. Just make sure that red wine is actually wine first, would you?
Well, my legs are long.
They call me long legs. My legs are hella long. This movie is mind-boggling. The vision behind it is really interesting and respectable, the direction and cinematography is immaculate, and I genuinely think Nicolas Cage pulls out one of his best serious acting roles to date here. But I think everything else kinda suffers because of its dedication to concealing itself. The whole first act or so feels like a really gripping thriller/procedural, but it feels the need to trick its audience into going with what it actually is by disguising itself as that, and I regret to say, I liked it better at the start. The actual themes at play just really left me wanting for more. It felt incomplete. It felt like they had a lot of really good ideas built up around a grand reveal, and when it came time to write that reveal, they were like, fuck it, I don't know. This film had a lot of promise, but for me, it drops the ball, which is really sad because I like a lot about it. Interested to see what I would think about it on a rewatch now that I know where it's going from the start. But now it's time for something completely different. Last year, we watched the original trio of Child's Play movies on Halloween night, and this year we decided to watch through literally everything else. Except for the remake. I've learned my lesson now. I know that that doesn't count. In the interest of keeping my thoughts cohesive, I'm going to include all of the films here and go through them in a lightning round gauntlet to keep it all brief and self-contained. We've got our Swedish meatballs here, Chucky's favorite. Why don't we finish off the Halloween section in style by f***ing with the Chuckster? Also, sorry for the screenshots. The copyright holders for these movies are notoriously itchy.
Well, John, it's been fun. but I gotta go. I have a date with a 6-year-old boy.
It's fine. Good animatronics, some iconic scares, but a lackluster setup and exceedingly silly premise that should have stuck to its original screenplay's guns.
Sorry, Jack. Chucky's back.
It's better. Really great set pieces in this one, and the animatronic work is even better. I'm starting to like the characters more, and Chucky himself gets quite a few laughs here. I also can't stop vocal stimming the way he says, "No!" Also a really good finale.
What the hell? You know what they say. You just can't keep a good guy down.
This one is bad. A military school setting is inventive for a horror movie, sure, but it just results in a lot of weird fluff and not enough of what we're here for. Also, Chucky is racist, and that's not cool!
Chucky's gonna be a bro.
Charles, you can't say that. We have a replica doll from this one, though, from when he gets turned into ground Chuck at the end. So that's pretty neat. I have to censor his face so that YouTube doesn't get mad at me, proving that this is the worst one.
Spell woman. B-I-T-C-H. That is incorrect.
This one is funny. It has its groaners, but the lean into horror comedy was a great direction for this series, in my opinion, and really helps it feel fresh and self-aware in a way that began to win me over after the snooze fest of 3. Also, hi Miss Jennifer Tilly. You can't see it, but I'm twirling my hair right now.
You're pissing your pants! You're pissing your pants!
This one is fine. I don't hate it as much as many others do, probably owing to the fact that it's got some surprising depth when it comes to its queer themes. It's not a scary movie, like, pretty much at all. If anything, the kills are just kind of comedic devices for the characters. It maybe goes a bit too far, but I still enjoy it overall. Some of the humor is really tacky, though. This one is good. It's a pretty decent pivot back to the horror side of the series, and some shots like the rat poison roulette scenes are really good. But in backpedaling so hard, I feel it kinda lost its confidence. It's like the Sonic colors of Chucky movies, you know? I'm also not crazy about the actual doll being used for Chucky here. It's supposed to look weird and fake for the reveal, but it just doesn't work. Even so, it has some cool ideas and some decent scares. Let it pass.
I just can't with this guy. I don't know whether to kill him or just take notes.
This one is weird. I like that it's more willing to get crazy again, which puts it above Curse for me, but it still feels kinda flat. None of the characters outside of the legacy cast and the protagonist from the previous movie really grabbed me, and some of its references do feel a bit Avengers Endgame-y, for lack of a better word. But it still has a really fun setup and gives the series some cool avenues to explore for the future. Also, Fiona Dourif kills it.
Gender fluid.
This was really fun! Between a really entertaining rotating cast that always includes Devon Sawa, a commitment to every element of its past, a perfect mix of comedy and drama, and the best visual rendition of Chucky yet. Like, seriously, this is the Smash Ultimate render of Chucky's. This show kept me engaged for pretty much all of its runtime. The first season has some pacing issues and some weak, underexplained plot points, but overall it still provides a fun horror comedy romp with some solid themes. Season 2 has an incredibly fun setting ripe for good story beats with the new cast, and it actually puts in a decent amount of effort to give the stuff from the legacy cast, and especially Glenn and Glinda from Seed, a decently satisfying conclusion. Also, Chucky gets exorcised by a Catholic priest and then makes him explode, which is really funny. And finally, Season 3 was pretty decent, but I think it ran out of steam. You'd think that setting it in the actual White House would lead to some of the most insanely over-the-top stuff from the series yet, but aside from one really funny scene involving the nuclear launch codes, it's surprisingly meek in what it actually allows Chucky to accomplish. The secondary cast for the season is also just way less memorable or entertaining than the ones in seasons 1 and 2. I do think it is a shame that this show got cancelled. I think a procedural soap opera-esque format was almost the perfect format for Chucky as a franchise to exist in, but considering that the legacy cast just keeps getting older, it might be for the best to wrap this puppy in another 1 to 2 films before it inevitably gets folded into the pantheon of bastardized pop cultural icons. Mr. Mancini, my hat goes off to you. You actually made me like a series I've always found pretty stupid as an adult and one I was incredibly terrified of as a child. Truly, we are all chucked.
Hey, I just found out it's November. What the happened?
One Piece? One Piece of what? People were glazing this special left and right when it came out, and I'll tell you what, as a person whose first tattoo was the Straw Hat Jolly Roger, you're not gonna catch me doing much differently. This is an incredibly sweet, bite-sized narrative, which I think perfectly highlights the appeal of One Piece as a franchise, and its world in a sort of meta way without leaning on the scales too much. Clearly the way this story is structured is about how every fan of One Piece has their blorbo of choice that inspires them in their daily lives, but it doesn't at all feel excessive or self-congratulatory about it, cleverly framing it within the actual world of One Piece in a believable way and creating compelling character arcs of its own to explore with the cast it creates for that purpose. You really get the sense that the Straw Hat Pirates are not just characters acting in a vacuum, but that the world around them lives and breathes just as much. Their actions have ripple effects that are much more personal than just big world-based developments. It's that intimacy which makes this world feel so much more worth being invested in. I would genuinely highly recommend this, even if you're not super familiar with the series, because the way it explores the setting through the eyes of people who are otherwise in its background really sells its scope in a way unlike anything else, and perhaps turns some of the intimidation surrounding its source material's length into the intrigue so many of its fans were hooked by. Aside from that, obviously, the animation is gorgeous, and the direction by Megumi Ishitani and Nanami Michibata is just breathtaking, seamlessly arranging hard-hitting visual after hard-hitting visual in an array near scientifically designed to yank at the heartstrings, even if you're not as big on this swashbuckling series as its millions of devotees. It only lasts a little over 20 minutes, but this is easily one of the best things I watched all year, and at the time of this upload, it's just on Netflix, so, you know, go for it.
Hello there. I'm Aaron Hansen.
Quick, Keiichi, find Colonel Sanders, we need him! Higurashi, as I've mentioned before, is another one of my favorite things ever, so you would think that a grounded film adaptation of its first arc that liberally borrows a few elements from its other entries would be something I find extremely interesting, especially being that I'm a huge fan generally of a lot of 90s and 2000s J-horror films. It is unfortunate then that I really did not enjoy this approach to the source material. To its credit, this film contains a lot of interesting adaptational decisions and doesn't fall into the trap of a lot of bad adaptations, like the Higurashi anime, tend to, of trying their best to copy and paste the material wholesale while stripping out as many lines as possible for the sake of consolidation. This movie does actually make an attempt to remix and reinterpret the material to mixed degrees of success. Its foreshadowing is actually pretty excellent, and the direction can often be really good. The sound design also isn't half bad. The more dreamlike sequences in the back half of the film also do a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to selling the feelings of confusion and anxiety that Onikakushi Hen, the arc this film is based on, is so excellent at conveying. But then you have everything else. Really flat characterization, very little actual focus on developing the group dynamic between the club members, which is so essential to the actual source material that leaving it out entirely feels particularly insane. Satoko and Rika barely have any screen time, Mion barely feels like Mion, Rena doesn't have any of her trademark personality traits, it's just so muted. That's the best word that I can muster for it. The spark of life in this story is gone, and is largely replaced with exposition, all of which doesn't even really lead anywhere, because this is an adaptation of the first of 8 chapters in an extremely long novel series, which was then not followed up, save for another film, which adapts its 6th chapter. This film feels somewhat uniquely terrified of leaning into the anime eccentricities that make Higurashi what it is, and even if that's the drive to make a more grounded adaptation of the material, what largely results from this decision is a movie that feels almost entirely stripped of its source material's personality, a project that only vaguely resembles what its inspiration set out to be. When the primary focus of Higurashi as a narrative is so carried by the attachment that you form with its characters, failing those characters in service to the bare-bones plot is always going to be the wrong decision. That's a shame when this film came so close in many other respects to getting it right. Once again, this reinforces my opinion that aside from maybe the manga and the drama CDs, the only good Higurashi worth experiencing is the source material. Who would have guessed?
I mean, it's gonna have to be... Oh, the misery!
Oh, sorry, Judge. We were borrowing the chair for the Knuckles fans. We didn't know the League fans would start multiplying. What feels like once in a lifetime, adaptations punch well above their weight class and become something uniquely great all on their own. As somebody who is admittedly not too fond of League of Legends, just can't say I fancy the death sentence, Arcane was always going to be a show that struggled with first impressions, and would have to work its way uphill to garner my fancy. Good thing it never stopped punching me in the face long enough for me to get a word of protest in. Between a finely tuned, gorgeous blend of all forms of animation, an excellently diverse cast, punchy direction, action, writing that constantly leaves you slack-jawed, and a score firing on all shark-toothed cylinders, if you can pardon the imagined dragons, this show is every bit the masterclass people pin it down as, and earns itself a top spot in my book of all-time greats. Season 1 is like a pitch-perfect poem from beginning to end. The second season stumbles over a few stanzas here and there, but it still aims for some high highs, which more than excuse its fraternization with some occasionally muddied lows. Call me a powder keg, the way I could feel myself ready to explode more than a few times while watching this. But those lows do exist. Some branches of the plot left me a bit wanting for further elaboration, or just time in general. Plus, as much as I am a woman who loves women, I can't say the popular Yuri of this one really grabbed me. Shame, because they do have some really in-your-face scenes, which is refreshing for a hater of the up-to-interpretation flavors of plausibly deniable queerness on television. If you're not watching this one because you'd rather not get caught up in the riot, I can't necessarily blame you, but when pen goes to paper and makes cinders this big, it's hard not to see the sparks coming from miles away.
Rick and Morty.
Great Scott, Marty. Your AO3 tag is terrifying.
There's really not a lot I can say about this movie aside from it's a classic and people love it for a reason. But twist my arm, why don't you? Rarely do I watch films nowadays that feel as tight or as perfectly wrapped up as this. It's just a masterwork when it comes to brilliantly compact storytelling. Gets you in and gets you out in very little time, while still perfectly satisfying everything you might want from it. The characters are insanely charming, the score is iconic, and the story itself is, sure, a little simple and a little weird at times, but also extremely novel in a way that perfectly explains why its pop cultural legacy is so pervasive. It helps that it knew when not to continue chasing its own success, at least in the theaters. A good trilogy is a good trilogy, and it doesn't always need more to bog it down, you know? This first one is obviously the best one, at least in my opinion, but that doesn't mean that the rest are any slouch.
Away in a taco.
I knew no good would come from city folk and their flying machines!
I had a blast with this one too, mostly because of just how into its own premise it continues to be. It has perfect confidence, and while I can see why some would call it a bit of a retread of the first installment, I think it distinguishes itself well enough to make those callbacks worth it. They feel more cute and thematic than they do the result of the writers running out of ideas. Also, Biff's comically over-the-top evil is genuinely really fun to see play out, and I like that he goes from just a jerk-ass in the first movie to being this time-honored piece of shit who would literally make the world around him worse by virtue of allowing himself to be successful. That being said, this was also filmed specifically to be back-to-back with its sequel, which means this one leaves off on a bit of a cliffhanger. At first I thought this was a little lame. I would have preferred this one still have an element of being self-contained, but considering that it carries Marty as a main character forward into a character arc which would only resolve itself with the third movie, I'm not as down on it as I was on my first watch. In many ways, I guess it was ahead of its time in the two-part movie field. If only I could go back in time and tell myself,
He's an asshole.
This is a really solid conclusion to the trilogy. I'd heard that this one had the most mixed reception, and while there are a few things about it that I think have aged less than gracefully, I generally think this is still a really good movie. It's as tight as the other two, it's charming, it has Doc Brown legendarily simping for a woman I can't guarantee would share his values. It's good stuff. What I really like about this movie the most, though, aside from the generation-spanning proof that the Tannins are just the absolute worst, is what it does for Marty and Dog. This movie really goes to show how much they've grown to gel with each other and like each other, and how much Marty has grown through his experiences with Dog. The ending, I will say though, does feel a bit random. Like,
oh hi Marty, I've got a magic railroad, abandoned my principles, and have creepy little omen children now.
Like, yeah, that's great, man. Anyway, Christopher Lloyd is definitely way better in this than as Patrick Mack. Shocker, I know.
I'm sorry, I do not know what you are talking about. I am normal.
Wait. This isn't Homestuck. In the world of webcomics, it can be very difficult to get your name out there, and if you're working on something entirely your own, it can be even more difficult to muster the energy for your story, when you know only so many eyes are actually on it. That's why for the scant few who can actually bring their stories to the finish line, I hold an immense amount of respect, and I extend that respect now to a comic I followed for about 10 years. Taz Mechanic's The Sanity Circus. Set in a weird and wacky world of magic instruments, animal shifters, phobia-based scarecrow creatures, and yes, even canon lesbians. Sansert, as it is so affectionately called, is a story that, while it definitely treads familiar ground in a lot of its plot beats, still manages to craft something both endearingly its own and cozily homegrown within its 3 volumes-ish worth of chapters. Main character Atlee Grimshaw, yes, that is her metal-as-hell name, is on your typical quest to find answers when her cool new friend turns out to be a sort of freak of nature, who might also just be in a toxic past-life situationship with her, and things spiral from there. I won't exactly say that this story spins in directions you've never seen seen before, as most friends I've wrecked this one to spotted many of its twists coming from a mile away, but that still doesn't mean that it's not chock full of heart, charmingly vivid artwork, and some absolutely fantastic character designs. It's also just refreshing as hell to see a story dedicate some actual focus to having queer characters while still allowing them to occupy said narrative very naturally. Their identities are not waved around as advertisements, nor are they underplayed or suffocated to better garner appeal. They are unapologetically, but still rather incidentally, themselves, and I can really appreciate that. Like many webcomic greats, however, its author did eventually run out of steam with the multi-year grind, which is why I am so thankful that despite this, its finale was committed to stylized script form instead of simply left to our imaginations. The way it paced out in reading definitely suffered a bit of a rush in my head since I didn't have all the pretty pictures to go with it, but it was still a satisfying bit of closure after reading for so long. Now that the whole thing is done, reading it all in an afternoon shouldn't be too tall of a task. This story is not a tome by any means, even if it does contain a few. That's a joke that you'll get if you read it, trust me. For all the memories it gave me though, I wanted to give it my strongest recommendation and plug it here. If you're into any of the stuff I've said about it, you should absolutely go give it a read. I'm putting the link to its website up on the screen right now. I think this one deserves a lot more love than it's gotten, so please, by all means, check it out and say that I sent you. And thank you, Taz, for all of your hard work. Good luck with your further creative endeavors, because I'll always be keeping a big gloopy Spycrow eye out for it.
Shut that door.
Christmas.
It's bad.
How many hot dogs did you eat?
Austin makes us watch this every f***ing year and forced me to put this here. I hate this movie more than life itself, bum biddy 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 bum bum.
Disaster al dente off the coast of San Clemente. 12 tons of pasta have leaked into the ocean and the massive carbo load is heading straight to Pacific Ocean City.
Dad, I had the noodle dream again. This movie is actually awesome, and I am not lying. For one thing, the art direction and fight choreography especially did not need to go this hard. There are so many frames in this movie where I literally just had to sit back in awe, like, oh my god, this shot is incredible. And then remind myself that it was from Kung Fu Panda. Not all of the comedy lands for me. I'm not an especially big fan of, oh, look, the fat guy likes food. But I do think the way that Poe's strengths are brought out of who he is, rather than forcing him into who he isn't, is refreshing regardless. It's a movie that doesn't really linger for longer than it needs to. It's got a surprising amount of heart, and the fights kick ass. Skadoosh.
I hope this turns out better than your plan to cook rice in your stomach by eating it raw and then drinking boiling water.
Wait, what do you mean there's genocide in this one? The first Kung Fu Panda is a pretty good movie about becoming a cool fighter, fulfilling your destiny, and being yourself. Kung Fu Panda 2 is about those things, but it's also about your past, where you come from, and the destruction of an entire minority group. I kind of love how monstrous the villain in this one is, but considering that this is a Kung Fu Panda movie, some problems arise for me which I found a bit predictable in how this film was set up. It kinda wants to be darker than the previous film, but it undercuts itself a lot with the typical family movie humor as a result. The grander scale for this reason didn't really land entirely for me. It just doesn't dedicate to its premise hard enough for that shift to feel earned. I still really like the animation and characters, of course, and listen, I'll never complain about seeing more of Master Tigress. But yeah, I don't know. I was just left wanting with this one in a way that I feel the first movie satisfied better. It's not a bad movie by any means, but it's got way more visible cracks.
I'm tired of Earth. Of these people. I'm tired of spending $60 for a computer game.
Apparently, there are Ghibli movies that aren't made by Hayao Miyazaki. Some people don't know this. Kaguya is a gorgeous film. Like, holy shit. If you absorb nothing else from this segment, please know that this movie is a visual feast for the eyes. The painterly, almost concept art in motion feel of it is something so unlike nearly any other feature film that I've watched that I can't recommend it enough, based solely on the artistry on display. The score is also absolutely beautiful, swelling and stopping at just the right moments to create maximum impact and heartbreak. This movie in the story department, though, is by no means a thrill ride. It is very much a slow, emotionally driven, fable or fairy tale-esque narrative, which, considering it is an adaptation of a story from the literal 10th century, stands to reason. There's a lot here which is very deeply compelling, especially if you're a historical fiction nerd, and especially if you're invested in the portrayal of women throughout fiction and history at large. But while I reckon much of this is obviously intentional, you're also going to feel extremely frustrated for this poor girl for that very reason. Never in my life has a film made me so many times repeatedly think the phrase, "leave her alone, get a job." This film has its twinklings of hope narratively, and ultimately I would still argue it pushes for a view of earthly life as very beautiful, but it also zeroes in on just how sad and disempowering life can be, especially when you're scorned, or worse yet, coveted. Life can be beautiful, but a life not lived for yourself can only ever feel incomplete. Watching this didn't make me feel happy. In fact, it made me feel pretty hollow by its credits. But I think it is worth the time I put into it, nevertheless.
Revenge Squawk.
By God, they found a PG way to kill that child. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 is in many ways one of the most terrifying movies I've ever had the privilege to anticipate. While I got deep into my Sonic obsession earlier into childhood than it came out, Sonic Adventure 2 was one of those seminal video game experiences that live deep down in my bones and will never leave. It wasn't the first 3D game I ever played, mind you, that honor still goes to its predecessor, but it is the first 3D game that was bought specifically for me. 2001 Blockbuster Video, a Dreamcast jewel case sitting on a shelf and then being bagged up and handed to me. My life changed forever. And if that sounds like gross nostalgic exaggeration, it probably is, but f*** you! Over the 24 years since that game's release, I have put hundreds of hours into it across both its original hardware, its port to Xbox 360, and of course, its Steam counterpart. I've played the story campaign back-to-back numerous times, both in its cheesy English dub glory and its excellently emotional original language track. The soundtrack was one of the first CDs ever purchased for me, and I listened to it on a portable CD player on trips, a boombox in my room, and even forcibly on my parents' car radio numerous times, always sure to ask them if they could even believe a song like Live and Learn came from that silly hedgehog game they knew I played all the time. To say this movie had enormous shoes to fill when it made clear its intentions to adapt that game, even loosely, is a severe understatement. Sure, I have been a lifelong fan of Sonic since I could even intelligibly speak his name, but this was my golden goose, and by God were they going to suffer several million wraths if I did not get my meal. I liked Sonic 1 well enough, even if it didn't really feel much like a Sonic movie. I thought Sonic 2 was a marked improvement, but it still had several key issues dragging it down. And of course the Knuckles TV series was a wretched little thing that made my anxiety over this movie all the stronger heading into its December release. The more advertisements dropped, the more I was mixed on several things I was being shown, and I knew for a fact that I wouldn't be able to fully decide how I felt until I got in that theater seat. And when I did, oh buddy, I loved it. Like sure, yeah, the persistent Sonic movie problems persist. Sonic himself is not quite Sonic. Tom exists. Wade, oh god, come on. But aside from that, yeah, this movie is easily the least dragged down by what it feels it has to be marketable, and pretty handily excels at everything else. The pacing is brisk and punchy, the actual Shadow backstory is very well condensed and perfectly impactful, the actors are all on their A-game, especially Keanu Reeves, who delivers the finest tightrope walk I've ever seen between restrained and stoic and emotionally volatile, and need I even say it, the action, the spectacle, is at its absolute finest. Hell, they've even got a tighter focus when it comes to the soundtrack, turning what is often another average Junkie XL film score into something that is a lot more Sonic-infused than it's allowed itself to be before now. Everything runs like clockwork to deliver a truly fantastic experience. For as much as I wanted to hear it run longer, I may have had a few tears dotted my eyes when I heard that familiar Crush 40 guitar riff, because this, for me, is what it means to be home. I do have other nitpicks though. The tonal clash hurts this one more than basically any other, even if the humor is dialed considerably back. Some of these jokes really kill the mood, especially when it comes to the two carries. Speaking of Vaccine Jim, I did really enjoy him in this yet again, but I wish we got a tiny bit more serious Gerald than we did. He actually really nailed it when we got into that territory, so I wish they would have been more confident and let him carry that for a bit longer. Shadow's backstory as well suffers a bit in its missing details. Sure, I do think it was smartly condensed, but the lack of an arc, the lack of Maria's terminal illness, these are things that aren't super glaring in their omission, but do rob the story of some of its nuance in the process. Some tweaks were arguably smart. I like that Shadow has more agency over his decisions here, even if he is still being manipulated, and isn't just operating on a misremembered memory. But then you have things like Maria's death being more of an accident than a heartless act of military violence, even if they did spring from similar negligence and fear. I get why they did it, but it does ultimately end up making it feel a bit more toothless. And for how hard-edged Sonic Adventure 2 was for its time, I can't help but find that a little disappointing. I Loved the stuff with Agent Stone though, like seriously, that end speech from Eggman may have stroked itself a little too much, but that culmination of their relationship was really solid. Agent Stone is easily the best original movie character of them all, I love that guy. Sonic 3 was never going to be a perfect reflection of its source material in any case. That's not what the Sonic movies are. They are still, at the end of the day, very family-friendly, corporatized interpretations of a popular game franchise starring A-list Hollywood stars and bankrolled by Paramount. But despite all of that, this skates right up to the line and becomes nearly the best version of itself that it could be, delivering not just on its adaptational choices, but also perfectly coupling them with its original elements in a way that is impactful, fun, and heartfelt. And that's all I can really ask for. Call it recency bias if you must, but for my money, they didn't beg, they may have borrowed, but they absolutely found their way.
It sucks, man.
Forgive the fact that this is going to be a little incongruous in tone with the rest of the video, but given this is me putting 2024 to rest for the channel and myself as we go into the new year, I feel it's only right to look into how 2024 treated me beyond just what I watched. 2024 was hard for me. I went through one of my biggest creative ruts. I was ground up against the wall of living on my own for the first time, and I even lost my dad. More and more, I've become aware of the strangely impersonal chasm that opens wider the more you cultivate a presence online, and that sadness really has become a chain around my neck. I can't make it prettier and say that it doesn't bother me. But at the same time, I've been very privileged to do some of the things I did in 2024 as well. I completed multiple stream series, I got a special little gavel gifted to me by Capcom, I met and spoke to Ryukishi07, the author of two of my favorite works of all time, and Sayaka Ohara, the voice of one of my favorite characters of all time. And I did all of that in California on the first solo trip I've ever taken for Anime Expo, a super fun convention where I even met several of my own viewers. There are parts of my life that have completely changed, for better and for worse, but I want to live. I want to keep doing cool stuff. I want to continue pursuing my passions, because there's a reason I do what I do in the first place. It's not for fame or glory, though it is for rent money. But most importantly, it's about expressing myself, connecting to others, and filling that hole in my heart that can only be done by creating what matters to me. I engaged with a lot of stuff that mattered to me this year, and that doesn't even necessarily mean I liked it all that much. The memories we share with art are powerful little crystallizations of everything that we are, everything we want to be. So hopefully, in sharing those memories with you, I've given you some direction to where you might want to head yourself. See you again for 2025, people! Hi everyone, thanks for watching my little media thread video. I thought this would be a fun idea to do, and surprise surprise, I've had a lot of fun writing for it. Not everything gets to be a big video, so sharing bite-sized thoughts on a lot of things, both good and bad, definitely felt a little cathartic. That doesn't mean, of course, that none of these things can't become bigger video topics in the future. In fact, I'm sure some of them absolutely will, but it's still fun to find excuses to share my feelings on the media I don't typically get a chance to spotlight. If you enjoyed my rambling and would like to support me monetarily, I've got a Patreon which you can sign up for to receive previews of new videos, as well as an invite to my Discord server. I've got a Ko-fi where you can send one-time donations, and there's also YouTube memberships, which you can get by hitting the join button right below the video, giving you access to any members-only posts I make, as well as some funny emojis you can use in my stream chats. Oh, there's also liking, subscribing, and commenting on the video. That was all the rage back in the 2010s. By the way, I stream pretty often. Weekly, in fact. I typically voice act my way through visual novels like Higurashi, or currently the Ace Attorney games I haven't played yet, but I also do other more variety-based streaming too. Right now I'm trying a Tuesday and Friday schedule out, so stop on by if you get the chance. And now allow me to thank some of the lovely patrons who make all of this possible, such as Serena Midori, ShogunDX, Friend of Dracula, Ali Oliver, Claire Meeboon, Bailey, Noelle Hadley, Joseph Adams, Weecon, MJL, Lord Omega 12, White Toast, Lay Fan, T, Saxon, 16 Crows in a Trenchcoat, Cass Reed, Indigo, Horsefry, CJ the Magic Goose, Niche Fish, JS, Phantom Falcon, Sad Boy Alert, Space Battery, Moidba Alsue, Big Yellow, Digimaniac 33, Sable Cowl, D-Bear, Elaine Allfelt, Sidra Hitching, Queen Elzyme, Waterbrat, Deviant Witch, Zero Enderborn, Bank Pads, Clovercool, Noah, Me Substitution, Evert Neely, Luna, Jane Yarley, Matt Hop, Jeff Ladd, Torterra454, Seditious, and JunePop45. Once again, thank you so much for watching, everybody. My first big video essay of the year should ideally be coming next, so hopefully you'll stick around for that. As always, take it easy, and have a happy new year. Peace.